front row with me. We volunteered from South Africa. Both of us had served in World War II. As you heard, I had 5 years during the war, and my wife was trained as a meteorologist. And when we came to Israel, we both signed on. We arrived on the 9th of May 1948. We signed on for the Air Force on the 10th of May 48, but there wasn't really an Air Force. In fact, I'll go into the story a little later of how we acquired aircraft and how those aircraft were brought to Israel. Those were the two tremendous challenges facing the nascent Air Force at the time. I would just like to go back a bit in history, because I think one must look at it from the historical perspective. The Holocaust and the declaration of the State of Israel on the 14th of May 1948, it was just before the Shabbat, when Ben-Gurion declared the state on Friday the 14th. The first Arab country to attack Israel was the Jordanian army. The Jordanian army had been trained by British officers and were led into action by British officers. And the nascent Air Force was asked to do an aerial reconnaissance to give the General Staff an idea of the strength of the invading Jordanian army. What we saw was quite a sobering experience. They already had entered Israel with tanks, armored cars, artillery, trucks, petrol bowsers. They were absolutely prepared for war. And they had already overrun the Etzion block. We learned afterwards that about 240 people, military and civilians, had been killed. 420 had been taken prisoner of war, and the whole kibbutz was on fire. And that was the sad report that we had to give to the General Staff. On the following day, the 15th of May, Israel was attacked by 5 other armies: Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Kauchi's forces in the Galilee. You can imagine the feeling in Israel at that time. The Arabs had an overwhelming superiority in every branch of military operations. Air Force, the British had supplied Egypt with 62 frontline Spitfire aircraft. This was an iconic aircraft from World War II. They supplied the Iraqis and the Jordanians. The French had supplied the Syrians and the Lebanese. And Israel did not have a single combat aircraft or a single anti-aircraft gun. The position really was absolutely desperate. But it was clear that we would have to fight for our lives if we were going to preserve the newly born Israeli state. That was a very difficult picture which confronted the Yishuv, as it was then known, in May 1948. The biggest problem, and here I would just like to dwell somewhat more on the Air Force. That was where I served, and of course I am more familiar with that story rather than the wonderful job done in the Army and in the Navy at that time. You may have heard, or in fact you saw on the screen, that there were 4,000 volunteers from abroad. Actually, the number was 4,800, and they came from 59 countries, mainly the Anglo-Saxon countries, the United States, South Africa, Britain, and Canada. As I said, they came from 59 countries. From some of the South American countries, 1 or 2 volunteers came, but nevertheless, they came to help their brethren in Israel. To proceed from that point of May of 14th and 15th of May 1948, I would like to remind you that the United States Secretary of State and the British Foreign Minister and the Arabs predicted that the war would be over within 2 weeks. And they were very nearly right. Israel had bought 25 aircraft from Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was the only country in the world who came to our help, not a single democracy. And these aircraft had to be brought over to Israel from Czechoslovakia. How was that to be done? There was an American by the name of Al Schwimmer. Some of you may be familiar with his name. He had vision and courage. He managed to smuggle out of America 14 C-46 large transport aircraft, 3 Constellations, 2 Skymasters, and 4 B-17 heavy bombers that played such a critical role in the attacks on Germany during World War II. I actually stated at Al Schwimmer's funeral, he died at the age of 92, that he saved the state of Israel, because Israel was entirely cut off from the rest of the world. And he realized that the only communication would be by air. So the aircraft which were bought from the Czechoslovaks were disassembled in Czechoslovakia. They were packed into the large transport aircraft, and they were flown to Israel, where they were assembled. And the first 4 aircraft were assembled on the 29th of May 1948. And this was truly a most critical date in the calendar of the Jewish people. The Egyptian army and air force, which were the strongest Arab air forces, the army had overrun all the kibbutzim in the south. The kibbutzim were having to fight tanks and armored cars and artillery with rifles and hand grenades and so on. And they had progressed in their advance right up to Ashdod. Ashdod is 30 kilometers from Tel Aviv. The officer commanding the Israeli troops was absolutely desperate. He said to the Air Force, if you don't stop the Egyptian army at Ashdod, the war is over. Exactly 2 weeks from the declaration of the State of Israel. Those 4 aircraft were not even test flown. They were not tested, there was no time. And their armaments were not checked, there was no time. But they took off. 2 Israeli pilots, 2 Machal pilots, one from America, one from South Africa. Asa Weizmann was one of the 2 Israelis, and Mori Alon, and they attacked the Egyptian army, which was then based at Ashdod, ready for their entry into Tel Aviv. Bear in mind that the government of Israel was based in Tel Aviv because Jerusalem was cut off by the Jordanians. There was no communication. They were still building the Burma Road. And as I said, the army commander was in a desperately difficult position. The aircraft attacked the Egyptian army, and one of the pilots who really led the formation, in his dive onto the Egyptians, he spotted a petrol Bowser, and he went for this Bowser, which exploded and set fires up all around the encampment of the Egyptians, and they never advanced a single meter beyond Ashdod. In my opinion, the 29th of May, on which this critical operation took place, is really a date for commemoration. I really believe that the mighty hand of the Almighty was with the Israeli Air Force on the 29th of May, 1948. I know that my time is limited, so I can't go into too much detail as to the course of the war. But let me say that the early days were desperately difficult days. The road to Jerusalem was cut off. There was no water, food, ammunition getting into Jerusalem. The attack on the Jordanian fortress at Latrun cost many, many lives. Young men who had come from displacement camps in Europe were thrown into the battle. They had no military training whatsoever. The losses were horrific, and the Israelis simply didn't have the force to capture the fortress at Latrun. The Egyptian Air Force was bombing Tel Aviv and strategic targets at their will. There was nothing to stop them. As I said, not a single anti-aircraft gun in the state of Israel. So the initial stages of the war were really extremely difficult, to put it mildly. By July 1948, 70% of the land area of Israel was occupied by enemy forces. But the Air Force, and here I would mention that parallel to the Israeli Air Force, we set up what was known as the Air Transport Command. These were the aircraft that were flying from Czechoslovakia to Israel, and those flights could only be done at night, and they were really terribly dangerous because the aircraft were fully laden. They had to fly over the Alps. The flying was done in all types of weather conditions. There were a number of accidents where the crews lost their lives and the aircraft were destroyed. That was the difficult route which had to be taken. And these aircraft brought in equipment, not only for the Air Force, but also for the Army and for the Navy. In October 1948, the turn of the tide had started. The central Negev, round about the Beersheba area, was liberated. The commander of that operation was a Machalnik, a volunteer, and if some of you are not aware, Machal is the acronym for Mitnadvei Chutz La'aretz, volunteers from abroad. And at this point I might mention there were some very, very outstanding men who came from abroad. Some of you may have heard of Colonel Mickey Marcus, who was a well-known officer in the American Army during World War II. He was placed in charge of the Jerusalem front by Ben-Gurion. Unfortunately, he was killed in an accident that occurred at night. In fact, they have a memorial service for him every year in America. And then there was Paul Schulman, an American who was head of the Navy. There was Ben Dunkelman, a Canadian officer, highly decorated officer, who commanded the 7th Brigade that liberated the Galil, and the Israeli Air Force was starting to build up its strength. Aircraft were smuggled into Israel because there was a United Nations embargo on the export of military equipment to the Middle East. So whilst the Arabs had been well supplied, the routes for acquiring military equipment was closed to the State of Israel. So the only option was, how do we break the embargo, sanctions against Israel? And Al Schwimmer, who flew all those aircraft out of America at great risk. As a matter of fact, he received a sentence in America of 10 years imprisonment. The judgment was deferred, and he was pardoned by Bill Clinton when he terminated his presidency. Those aircraft had to come to Israel. They flew from the United States to Panama, and then to the islands in the ocean, and then to Brazil, and then to Africa, and then to Czechoslovakia. It was a tremendous effort in order to get the aircraft to the Israeli Air Force. One of the heavy B-17 bombers was actually impounded by the FBI, so that we had just 3 heavy bombers when we conducted the war in the later stages. Excuse me. Aircraft were smuggled into Israel, 4 boat fighters from Britain, and Israel then purchased 50 Spitfires, which was a tremendous acquisition. They were also purchased from Czechoslovakia. But unfortunately, at that time, the United States and Britain put so much pressure on Czechoslovakia that they terminated the air bridge which had been established. As I said, the tide of the war was turning in Israel's favor. I should mention, by the way, that the War of Independence was Israel's longest war, from the 14th of May 1948 to the 7th of January 1949, a period of 8 months. It was Israel's costliest war. 6,300 civilians and military personnel were killed in the war, which represented 1% of the entire Yishuv. The population of the Yishuv at the time was between 600 to 650,000. And perhaps more importantly, it was Israel's most fateful war, because if that war had been lost, we wouldn't be gathered here this evening. The Arabs, by the way, were so arrogant that at the beginning of May, the General Secretary of the Arab League, by the name of Azam Pasha, declared that if the Jews should dare to declare a state, the forces that would be unleashed on them would dwarf what Hitler had done to the Jewish people. He reinforced his statement a few weeks later and said this was going to be a war of extermination. Untold massacres would fall on the Jewish people. So I mentioned earlier that the mood in Israel when the war started was really very somber. We heard the words of the American Secretary of State, Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary in Britain, and then the Arabs' declaration. The big battle against the Arab armies was against Egypt. Ben-Gurion briefed the army, or officers in the army, before that offensive started. And that offensive started on the 22nd of December. Fortunately, again, due to the unbelievable enterprise and innovation of an American who was both a pilot and an aviation engineer by the name of Sam Pomerantz. Our problem, as I said, how do we get the Spitfires from Czechoslovakia to Israel? And he devised a plan whereby he fitted fuel tanks under the wings of the aircraft, under the belly of the aircraft, and even in the cockpit. And he increased the fuel capacity by 4.5 times And the Spitfire, which used to fly for 1.5 hours, was flown for over 6 hours from Czechoslovakia to Israel. By the time that the offensive against the Egyptians started on the 22nd of December, we had 22 of those Spitfires in the Air Force. And so the Air Force was pretty well equipped with 3 B-17 heavy bombers, with C-46s, with 2 P-51s that had been smuggled, with Beaufighters that had been smuggled, with Harvards that had been smuggled from Canada. And that's how the Israeli Air Force started, really from ground level, or perhaps even from lower than ground level, into the Air Force which today is really the envy of the world. You may have seen on one of the clips that 123 of the volunteers, the Machalniks, were killed during the war, 119 men and 4 women. We have a very beautiful memorial to those who fell in the Yitzhak Rabin forest. And here I would just like to quote the words of Yitzhak Rabin when the memorial was commemorated. He said to the Machalniks, "You came to us when we needed you most during those dark and uncertain days of our War of Independence. You gave us not only your experience, but your lives as well. And the people of Israel and the state of Israel will forever cherish the memory of the volunteers from abroad." And Ben-Gurion put it this way. He said that the Machal forces were the diaspora's most important contribution to the survival of the state of Israel. And before I end, I would just like to tell you one humorous story. On a flight of 2 Spitfires, which were attacking an Iraqi column which had invaded Israel, one of the Spitfires was flown by an American pilot who had just arrived on the squadron the day before. And in the attack, his aircraft was badly damaged. He realized he would not be able to get back to his base, so he flew out to sea. And when he reached the shoreline, he bailed out. And as he hit the ground, he saw a number of kibbutzniks who were running towards him with rifles. Now, nobody in Israel knew that we had just acquired these aircraft, so he was sure that they would mistake him for an Egyptian pilot. And he didn't know a word of Hebrew, so he ran towards them with his arms raised above his head. He didn't know a word of Hebrew, and he kept on yelling, "Shabbos gefilte fish, Shabbos gefilte fish." And that was one of the humorous stories which came out of the War of Independence. So, to conclude, folks, you know, there are over 80 Christian countries in the world, and there are about 60 Muslim countries in the world. And there is going to be one Jewish country, State of Israel, until the end of time. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them.